Why is the national accounting system so valuable? Can we trust economic data to not be politically biased? And what does it mean to say that complexity is a subsidy? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of eConception. eConception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the giant stack of responses from the 119,000 businesses that the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveyed this month for the jobs report. Our guest today on eConception is Dr. Bill Beach. Dr. Beach is currently a senior fellow at the Economic Policy Innovation Center based in Washington, D.C. But before that, he was the Commissioner of Labor Statistics, which is the leader of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And those are the people who put out the inflation report and the jobs report and lots of other information as well. And I wanted to have Bill on the show because I wanted to talk to him about national accounts. One of the things that he likes to talk about is how national accounts are extremely important and they're one of our most valuable economic resources. And so I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. So thanks so much for joining us today, Bill.
Well, Dominic, it's entirely my pleasure to be here. You picked one of my favorite subjects. I once wrote that they're in the top 3 inventions of the 20th century. That is from 1900 to 2000, whatever. The national accounting system is one of those 3 big inventions. And I'm putting in there the microchip and the automobile and everything else, right? Because we just can't understand the world we live in unless we have statistics. And the statistics of the national accounting system really tell us the size of the economy, the direction of the economy, all these things that we just kind of take for granted. So I'm real eager to talk about this.
Yeah, so obviously we've got a country of 330 million people who every day, about 180 million of them go to work. We've got many more than that buy or sell something at some point. There's just so much going on. On top of that, we have the entire world's population of 8 billion people that we interact with in various different ways. So how in the world can an agency in Washington, D.C. possibly pull together information that is useful enough and that actually works to tell us something about a system that mind-bogglingly complex?
Yeah. There's that expression you heard during the Clinton administration that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes 26 statistical agencies to tell you about the world you live in. So it's like being with the UN. Well, anyway, let me answer your question directly. So if we back up for just a second, let's just talk about the concept. Everybody understands the concept of gross domestic product. That's the total value of all goods and services produced for sale in a single year. And you've all heard about the growth in GDP and the growth in this and the growth in output. I suspect most people listening to your podcast are fairly sophisticated people, and they probably have heard about that. Well, the surprising thing is you can't go out into the farmer's field and pick GDP. It doesn't exist in the forest. You can't go out and fish for it. That's funny to people, but it makes a point. GDP is a construction of our minds. Gross domestic product is an intellectual product of the way we're seeing the world. So we know with all of our activities, everybody's activity, the 330 million, the 180 million on the job, that they must be doing something that would sum up. If you took all of the losses and the gains, you would hope that there would be more gains than losses. But the first kind of effort on this was done by the French at the end of the 18th century with the thing they called the tableau économique. And it was an effort to sum up the size of the French economy by counting the goods as they crossed the various provincial boundaries. And then on into the 19th century, more efforts were made. Finally, into the 20th century, with the 1920s, we get through the efforts of Wesley Clare Mitchell, who founded the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is very famous. The first effort to systematically count with rules the size of the economy. But it wasn't until Simon Kuznets came up with the national income and product accounts in 1935 that we actually get something that everybody could agree, well, there's an accounting system that will help us do a lot of things. For example, how do you count investment? How do you count research and development? Those kinds of dollars. Where do you put them? Are they costs? Are they output? Are they inputs? All these decisions have to be made. If you think about the standard accounting system that everybody's familiar with, that you go into the office and it says accountant on the door. And of course you go in with great trepidation, at least I do. And so they have rules for putting things in the asset column and the liabilities column and so forth and so on. Well, we have rules for a national accounting system. The national accounting system is called the National Income and Product Accounts. It's maintained by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They're the ones that officially release the data, but they get data from everywhere. They get data from my old agency, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from the Census Bureau, from a lot of data on trade, from the Commerce Department, but then they get a lot of private data. The value of all insurance issued in the United States comes from a private company called AM Best. And a lot of people don't realize the amount of private data that goes into these accounts. So the whole purpose of the account is to tell us how big are certain things, like how big is the consumption of households. We call that personal consumption expenditures. How big are the spending of corporations or of businesses? How much trade do we have going in and out of the United States? That's pretty important, especially as one political party has a candidate that is thinking about putting tariffs in place. So you really need to know your benchmark. How much is the trade before you begin to think, well, what's the impact of the tariffs? And then, of course, back to old GDP. GDP is sort of the sum of it all. That's the sum. Just think of the complexity of how you get this. That is the dollar value of all goods and services sold in the economy in a single year. It is sold for final sale to the final consumer. There's a lot of concepts in there. So it's an amazing invention. And after it was invented, and it became even more amazing because it became the basis of a UN treaty called the System of Accounts Treaty. I think it's treaty. Look at this treaty there. And I've lost track, but I think about 137 countries have signed on to this. So now worldwide, I can say to my counterpart in France again, well, how big is your GDP? And she will be measuring GDP the same way I will be measuring GDP in the United States. And now I can compare how two countries are doing. And now I can compare 137 countries. So it has become one of the main ways that we measure human progress. And it's done a world of good. You cannot believe how much better our economic policy is today than it was 100 years ago or 80 years ago. We complain about economic policy and we make a huge amount of mistakes, but it's just such a better system now. We can measure effectiveness. We know if we're off track. I mean, look at the infrequency of recessions. We used to have recessions on a kind of a regular basis. And now, because the Federal Reserve has developed very refined tools based on the national income and product accounts, they can say, well, we need to be twisting the dial here and twisting the dial there. And sometimes they get it right. And they're able to keep us from going into a recession when we're in tough economic times like we are now. So, yeah, it's really an amazing system. As you can see, I'm a fanboy for the NIPA accounts.
Of course. And if, that is certainly an impressive accomplishment that statisticians and economists have been able to pull together, right? You were saying how difficult it is to even conceive of this idea of all of the economic activity that happens in a country for final goods and services in 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
And so once we pull that information together and we put that number out and we sort of boil it all down into one number and call that GDP. Some people will criticize that. You'll hear people on the left sometimes will say that, okay, that's fine, but that's not everything. And obviously there are these other important things and we should be thinking about social factors and environmental factors and all those kind of things. And then on the right or sort of on the more libertarian right, you'll sometimes hear criticisms of GDP as being an oversimplification of economic complexity because you can't just homogenize down every economic activity into one number. And the diversity of different activities within the economy are such that really sort of reduces our knowledge actually of what's going on. And instead of appreciating the full sort of spectrum of human action, some might say. So what would you say to those sort of criticisms of the GDP accounting system and this idea that we actually can boil down a measure of human progress down into one number?
Yeah, I think all those criticisms have merit. And I don't think that too many people who are advocates of the national income and product accounts would disagree. I think they would say, well, yes, we should have we should have a system of environmental accounting system, right? A national income and product accounts that measures the value of air and the value of water, which NIPAs don't do right now. Okay, so there have been some efforts made to create alternative or satellite national income and product accounts. One of them measures human happiness. When I first heard of this, I was highly skeptical that since I can't even measure my happiness, how I could measure somebody else's happiness, right? Subjective, well, it's not really measuring subjective states of satisfaction. It's measuring whether or not there is a good life that's being attained. So we have to define what is a good life. Well, if you think about it, that's the same problem that Simon Kuznets had back in the 30s of how do we define output? How do we define inputs? So there was a commission back in the aughts called the Sarkozy Commission. It was basically housed in the OECD, and the political chair was the president of France, that began this effort of defining the inputs and the outputs of a happiness accounting system. And it's made a lot of progress. And we will soon have something like that. Now, I think that will address a lot of the concerns people have that you expressed. And it goes like this. Simply getting more goods and services is not a good measure of the good life. And I think everybody would agree to that. And then I just wanted to say one thing about another accounting system. More than 25 years ago, we began to think about a system of measuring the environmental quality of the economy. Now, not of our air, not of the particulate level in the air, and that's which EPA does. But if we were to add the value of air and the value of water and the value of land in terms of their quality, how much better are they today than 25 years ago? That would be a very important metric to have in terms of governing our future policy. So William Nordhaus at Yale began this process of putting together environmental accounts, and he wrote a whole book on the subject, and now there are satellite accounts being deployed at BEA that will do just that.
All right, so you were mentioning before how important these national accounts are for making policy, and obviously that's something that politicians are very interested in. And so if given the power that these national accounts hold, it would be helpful to politicians to get them to say things that they want them to say. So clearly, something that would make their policies look better, something that would make their opponents' policies look worse, things like that. And so what sort of safeguards are in place in the U.S. To make sure that politicians don't interfere with the output of the national accounts and making sure that they actually say reliable, they actually contain reliable information that we can trust no matter which president is in power.
Right. It's a perennial problem. And let me just first put out a prior. I don't know of too many politicians who wouldn't take advantage of an opportunity to affect the unemployment rate if it was to their advantage to do so. I mean, most of them would stop, but they'd be tempted. And we have a very famous story of Richard Nixon, who during his presidency tried to fire the Commissioner of Labor Statistics and get the unemployment rate changed. So following that, Congress passed a whole series of laws that protects the statistical system. And then the Office of Management and Budget in the White House issued from those laws regulations, and these are called the Statistical Policy Directives. and there are about 11 of them. The first three govern the scientific integrity and independence of the statistical system. Statistical directive number one is very important about the independence and who runs it and who can influence it, and so forth and so on. And it's great material. Those regulations are enforced by the White House Chief Counsel's office, and he or she does a very nice job of doing that. During my tenure, I was also the chief statistician of the United States for 3 years of my 4-year term, and I had to deal with that in several agencies, particularly the effort by the administration to affect a change to the 2020 census by introducing a citizenship question. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And after the Supreme Court rejected the effort by the administration to introduce that question, then the administration inserted political appointees in the Census Bureau to help direct or to assist, I don't know, the collection of the census. We were able to use the statistical policy directives to insulate the census operations from the political influence of these political appointees. So I know firsthand that it works. Will it always work in the future? No, we have to be continuously and daily vigilant. The statistical system needs to be able to collect the data and process the data without the data or the finished product being shaped to political agendas. It's a constant suspicion that that's happening, and I can tell you that it is a good suspicion to have, but it has not been realized in fact in any significant way. Now, there have been some examples of small agencies running afoul of their more powerful departments. So you get a small statistical agency. I'm not going to point out to one, but let's just imagine one that's relatively small. You don't know it. We call it the Bureau of X, fixing the net. And it reports to another department that reports to another department that reports to the secretary of that whole agency. Yeah, they can be really affected. They can have their product suppressed. Bad news is never one they want published. When that happens, then there's a group called the Interagency Council on Statistical Policy that I chaired that will help enforce the regulations on that department. So there is in the statistical system a kind of a police power. And if the president's willing to wrap some knuckles, then we'll get that little agency protected. So there are systems in place. It's a human world we live in. We're not perfect, but I can assure people that everyone in the statistical system knows it's hugely important. Let me just conclude on this. When President Biden took office in January of 2021, one of the first executive orders he signed was an executive order on scientific integrity, which applied not only to science offices, but applied to the statistical system. And in it, he says it's the will of this administration that these agencies will achieve their goals and ends without political interference.
And so just like we have checks and balances for the government in total in the Constitution, we also have checks and balances within the statistical agencies to sort of make sure that things are getting out in the right way. One of the recent accusations we've heard about this was about the jobs data. In August, the Bureau of Labor Statistics did its benchmarking of the jobs data, and it basically found that it had overshot job creation numbers by about 800,000 jobs. And so you had Donald Trump on the campaign trail calling this a huge scandal. You had a fair number of people, Republicans, calling out the agency, trying to say that they were inflating job creation numbers to make the Biden administration look better than it actually was, and by extension, then to help Kamala Harris in the upcoming election. First of all, can you tell us what that benchmarking process that they do, what that actually entails? And then second of all, why was this something that was actually expected and wasn't the scandal it might have seemed like?
Sure. So everyone not everyone, but a lot of people know that on the first Friday of each month, the Labor Department issues what's called the jobs report. And a lot of investors are very focused on this. there are two surveys behind that jobs report, and one of them is what we're going to talk about with respect to this benchmark. That survey is called the Current Establishment Survey, and it is a big survey. There are about 12 million firms that have independent existence in the United States. You know, you might think of Burger King as a firm, and each one of the Burger King outlets as a separate firm, but they're really not. Those are franchises. There's one business, lots of little places where it does business. The McDonald's, on the other hand, those are leasee operations. So each McDonald's is an independent firm. There's a lot of them. All right. So we survey about 300 to 400,000 of those firms each month out of 12 million. And we don't do all of them because it'd be too expensive to do all of them. And then on the basis of the surveys, we use some mathematics, some modeling to project what the national total is that month based on the surveys. Well, you know, the survey projections will never be right. They'll be off. You can't be perfect on the basis of picking 300,000 out of 12 million. You're not going to hit the mark for all the effort that's done to hit the mark. Well, that means that each year we need to go back and benchmark our estimates, monthly estimates, against the whole census of the 12 million firms. That fortunately exists. It's called the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. And each March it is completely done. Okay, it says quarterly, but really the quarters are not all equally created. So the March quarter is a complete and total census of all the firms. So what we do is we look at our estimates against this perfect census, and we see, well, how off are we? We've been doing the benchmarking since the late 1940s. It's done every year for obvious reasons. In some years, we have like seven people. We're going to serve 7,000 people. In some years, we get like 902,000. That was the biggest one since in the past 20 years. That was 2009. We had a 902,000 minus downward adjustment. So this 818 was the second largest since 2009. But if you look at every year, some of them during President Trump's term, I was the commissioner and I had one minus 500,000. Well, he wasn't trying to cook the books and I wasn't trying to cook the books, and it wasn't a scandal then. And then the very next year, I had an offsetting 494,000 plus. I added 409. He liked that a lot. So it goes like that every year. This year, the date of the benchmark preliminary announcement, because that's what it was. It'll be two. The final will come in February. The preliminary was advertised for 4 months, and it was advertised as August the 21st. So it was not a surprise. It was not released early. It was released exactly on time. When candidates say that it was released early to affect the election, they're wrong. And it's released by a group of people at BLS, a small group, who are as non-political and disinterested in politics as any people I've ever met. All they want to do is get these numbers correct. In some years, the numbers go up. In some years, the numbers go down. Now, this is a big adjustment. And I do think I've written an article that's going to be coming out in a couple of days that suggests that Congress needs to find out what happened, and Congress needs to fund changes to the surveys. Because I know that being commissioner, what was probably at fault, and it can be corrected by improving or modernizing the surveys. If the surveys are modernized, there's still going to be an error because you can't have perfection. But I don't think we'll have these big swings like we do now. So I ask Congress to act. I give its directions and where it should go. But I do think it's important that Congress have an oversight hearing and find out from the people at BLS, well, this is what we did. It will be amazing to everybody how boring that oversight hearing will be. But I think it's important that light be shed on this, because a lot of false and injurious things have been said about the Bureau.
Sure. And one of the other sort of related issues to this is when we're talking about jobs, you have the employer survey and you have the household survey, and those two different ways of getting at the same information is what they should be, right? So a household survey is asking employees, asking workers, do you have a job? The employer survey is asking businesses, how many jobs do you have? So those should be getting at the exact same thing because everyone who's employed has an employer, and so that should match up. But we've seen the last couple of years a bigger and bigger gap between the employer survey and the household survey. And so, how is that sort of a factor of this just being an outdated way to do this, and the new economy we need to adjust to that, or what can we do to try to get those numbers to be closer to what they should be?
Right. The goal should be for the two surveys, which is you correctly point out, measure a little different things. They should move in the same direction and they should move parallel to one another. They won't come up with the same numbers. The survey we just talked about that has the benchmarking, that's a survey of firms with payrolls. The household survey includes all those people, all the payroll employees, but it also includes millions of people who are self-employed, who are partners, who are subchapter S, who are LLCs. We have about 8 million firms in the country that have no employees. They're called employee-less firms. These are people who work for themselves. Well, they don't show up in the survey we just talked about. They're not in the benchmark survey. So what's wrong with the household survey? Well, there's a lot that's wrong. I must say that survey is losing its pulse. We are challenged there by two things: the growing unwillingness for people to sit down and fill out a long survey every month. And that's affecting what we call the response rate. So we survey 60,000 households, but our response rate now is 70%. And that means we get 49,000 households out of there. I mean, it's really pretty awful. The other thing is the high cost of collecting. Dominic, it's just a big deal. Inflation's hit everything, but it's hit the CPS right between the eyes. Our wage bill is way high, and we're now borrowing money inside BLS, inside Census. Those two organizations cooperate in the collection of the data just to pay the wage bill. So I've been working with members of Congress and others to get the CPS, the household survey, modernized, just like the other survey needs to be modernized, so that we will have this wonderful survey that tells us about the demographics of the workplace. That's where we get the number of African Americans who are unemployed, the number of women who are employed, the number of women who are between the ages of 25 and 54 who are employed, the number of women with children who are employed. All these wonderful demographic data that come in, and people want more data like that. They don't want less. Well, we need a bigger survey then. So we're at a kind of a nice little turning point here. I don't think it's like the end of the world, but we're at a turning point for those surveys and other surveys in the government. They need to be modernized. They need to use computer data. They need to blend public and private data. All these things need to happen, and we have plans for them to happen. So we know what we want to do. We just need the money to do it.
Are there any other countries that have, successfully modernized their statistical systems that maybe U.S. can learn from?
Well, I think there's one, and you'll recognize this right away. It's Great Britain. So they have moved away from a household survey like we do, that is with data collectors who go out to a house, knock on a door, and collect data, to a completely internet-based household survey. So they survey every month. They survey 500,000 households. We survey 60,000 households. And the record from the Office of National Statistics in Great Britain is that 500,000 is producing really good results at lower costs. Well, that's the direction we should go. I mean, we may not want to go to a complete internet base because we're a much bigger and more complicated country. So we've got we have our demographic differences here are even bigger than Great Britain's, which is a demographic stew. But I do think we can do a blend of an internet base, say 500,000, plus some surveys, just to have kind of a benchmarking going on. Yeah, I think that would be the good. And many countries are doing that. The Organization of Economic Development and Cooperation, their member states are all experimenting with these high-tech answers to doing surveys. we're just behind, and it's going to start hurting our economy, and it's going to hurt our public policy because data will be less available for policymakers to make good decisions. We won't go back to the pre-Simon Kuznets days. We won't do that, but we'll lose data. We'll lose data. It's just inevitable that that's going to happen unless we make some changes.
One of the things that I think is interesting about losing data and about just data that we don't have is about marriage in the United States. We don't collect at the national level. We don't have a sort of a national answer to how many people get married in the United States, how many people get divorced. That's usually pulled together by private researchers and academic researchers in various different ways, and so those estimates can be helpful. But we don't have a national answer for that right now. Why do you think that is, and what is that something that we should be looking to add to our statistics as well?
So I think the origin of the domestic statistics hiatus, if you will, or the fact that we don't have that at the federal level, is the recognition years and years ago that those data were collected by the states. The states issue marriage licenses. The states administer under their domestic policy laws different kinds of divorce statutes. And in fact, marriage is a little different across states, not generally, but a little different. We don't have the data in driver's license, for example. And oddly enough, this will surprise people. We don't actually own the unemployment insurance data. The unemployment insurance data is owned by the individual states through their employment security system. And a lot of health data is not shared with the federal government. So the question is, can we come up with cooperative agreements with the states whereby we can aggregate some of that data, publish it for the public good, but nevertheless continue this federalism answer, which has worked pretty well, whereby the states collect a lot of data about people in their lives inside the states, and we are able then to kind of bring that data to bear at the national level. That's starting to happen with the health data. You go over to the Center for Health Statistics, and you'll see more and more health data is coming from the offices of vital statistics at the state level. We are running pilot programs with 15 states right now to create what are called enhanced employment records. These records would include information which is collected by the states, and they would be put onto the employee's record with the UI system. And we federal people would be able to use that data without personally identifying information, to get statistics that we really would like to have right now. For example, we don't know very much at the federal level about workers who leave work, come back into work, leave work, and come back into work, and what skills and what characteristics, work characteristics they have. Their educational attainments are hard to get. We have to marry data from the Center for Education and Statistics at the Department of Education with labor data, but it's very poorly done. So there are a lot of federalism experiments we ought to be doing, and I hope that one day we'll be funded to do that. Again, it's a matter of funding, and that is always a challenge. Let me just say one more thing on this. This is a great part where private-public partnerships would really work well. We could get funding from organizations to create these data, funding to continue them, and the public could play a role in that, but they wouldn't be the exclusive funders of those data.
Yeah, I was going to ask, obviously we have lots of budget problems, and this is something that you guys at Epic talk about all the time, about our debt problems and our spending problems. And so obviously asking for more money is going to be something difficult to come by. But how much money are we actually talking about here? Because, we look at how much money the government spends on lots of different things. What is actually the budget of the BLS right now, and how much more money are we actually talking about?
Well, BLS is the second biggest statistical agency in terms of dollars, and it is about $695 million. So its budget worth about 5 hours of the Defense Department's annual budget.
Yeah, that's just so listeners here, that's million with an M. It's less than $1 billion.
Yeah, less than $1 billion. And to create the new CPS, right, we would need to have 2 years of testing. 1 year to finish up the survey and field it, and the next year to test it against the current survey. And to do both of that and to come up with a brand new CPS, it would last for a long time and everybody would be happy and cheers in the street. It would cost $15 million. To change the CES, which is now this outrageous conspiratorial thing of 818,000 fewer jobs, to improve that is even less expensive because it's all machine collected. It's all collected at data centers. We think that to modernize that would be in the neighborhood of about $10 million. So for $25 million, we could save BLS's two major surveys. And again, $25 million is the coffee bill one morning at the Department of Defense. Or it's like 15 minutes of interest payments per year. The magnitudes are small. Yes, we should pay for them by offsets somewhere else in the budget. I think that's very true. But to find those offsets should not be a big deal. We could just cancel some program that's not working, hasn't worked for 50 years, and continues to be fun because it's too small to cut. Well, but now's a good time to cut it.
And if we can avoid making billions of dollars in economic policy mistakes based on bad information, I think spending $25 million now is probably a good idea. Thanks so much, Bill, for talking to us about this. Learned a lot, and I hope listeners will as well.
My pleasure entirely. Thank you.
So we discussed there with Bill a little bit about the recent controversy with the jobs report. I wanted to walk through in a little bit more detail some of the issues there. He obviously talked about the checks and balances within the statistical system that prevent political bias from coming in, and that actually worked pretty well for that purpose. It's important to remember, as Bill mentioned, that it's not just the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but there are countless agencies within the U.S. government that produce really important information. One of the ones that is not only an authority for the U.S., but also for the world is the Energy Information Administration. They put out data that people all over the globe look at, and about other countries as well. They do that all the time. And so it's even stuff beyond sort of our domestic politics that those agencies have to keep in mind. But just looking at the BLS specifically and just looking at this jobs issue specifically, like we said, they revised down the job numbers by 818,000 jobs, which was a pretty big miss. It's big in the sense that it's larger than past misses, but it's still only 0.5% miss in total. So, if from a purely statistical point of view, missing by 0.5% in a country with a workforce of about 180 million is not that big of a miss. It's not like they are really, really bad at this or something. But let's look at the political issue. Bill walked through some of the safeguards that are in place to make sure that politics doesn't get into this. But really, let's just look at the claim that this was politically biased, just from a common sense point of view. Right. So the first thing is that, one of the things that Trump said was that the BLS got caught faking the job numbers. Nobody caught them. They were revising their own data. Right. So and they were doing it on the same schedule that they do every year. Every August, they do this. So it would look a lot more suspicious if they had, for example, delayed this revision until December, until after the election. That would have been suspicious. It would have been suspicious if this revision didn't usually go both ways. But it does. In 2022, they revised job growth upward in August of that year. And that was when Biden was president too. So that meant that for the year prior, they were understating job growth under Biden. And then that was 2022, right before the midterm elections for Congress. So were they biased against Democrats then? Probably not. In 2019, when Trump was president, they did a similar downward revision of 500,000 jobs. So was the agency biased in favor of Republicans then? Probably not. The fact that this goes both ways is a really important part of how we can trust it, right? Because if it was purely a problem of statistical error, which is inevitable, there's always statistical error, there's always residual error in estimates like this. If it's truly error, it should be random. And if it's random, it should be an overestimate about half the time and an underestimate about half the time. If we see it being biased onto one side, not necessarily one political side, but one numerical side, if it's always an undershoot or it's always an overshoot, then we should be worried that it's biased. But the fact that it goes both ways is one of the indicators that it's not biased. The BLS also puts out plenty of other data sets that don't make Democrats look good. For example, Joe Biden has often said that he's trying to run the most pro-union administration in American history. But the BLS puts out a union membership report every year. In the last 2 years, it has shown record lows in union membership in the U.S. And so if they were biased in favor of Democrats, it'd be kind of weird for them to be doing that. And I think one of the bigger issues here, just more of a fundamental issue, is that people don't actually go out and vote based on what statisticians in Washington, D.C. say. They vote based on their personal experience. If it was really true that the Bureau of Labor Statistics was somehow gaming the job numbers to make Joe Biden look better, but those numbers were wrong, and actually more people were unemployed and more people were out of work than they had suggested. If that was actually true, then people would feel that and they would know that. There's a little bit too much of an obsession, I think, among politicians and among people in and around Washington, D.C., that says that sort of the narrative is everything and that all that really matters is what's going on in the news, what's being reported. And so the follow-on conclusion from that is, well, if we can just control the narrative, if we can control what's reported and we can make what's reported look good, we can basically trick people into thinking just about anything. And obviously, the media plays a role in perceptions of people's lives. It's not that it's irrelevant. But the idea that you could turn a bad economy into a good economy simply by fudging some numbers and reporting them in different ways just seems a little bit silly. And I don't think the American people are quite that gullible, quite that easily fooled by statisticians in Washington. So I think this whole thing was blown way out of proportion. And as Bill said, there's absolutely need to look at modernizing the Bureau of Labor Statistics, to look at some of the statistical methodology so that we can be more accurate. More accuracy is always good. And as he pointed out, this is not a large amount of money we're talking about in the perspective of the federal budget that could make a real difference to modernizing this process. But it's really boring statistical issues that are in play here. Not political issues, not partisanship. It's really just about modernizing the process and doing that in a way that would lead to better results, which, as Bill said, is really important because these numbers do matter for economic policy and for history as well. We use these data sets all the time in studying the past, and the more accurate they are, the more we can learn from past mistakes and past successes. So enough of that in the weeds stuff. I want to talk about a more general topic, which is complexity as a subsidy. This is a topic that gets talked about a fair amount, and it can mean a couple of different things. And so I kind of want to walk through what those are. I most recently heard this in a book discussion at the Competitive Enterprise Institute with Tevi Troy, who has a new book out about the relationships between CEOs and presidents. And one of the things he said is that complexity is a subsidy. And so I wanted to dig in a little bit more about what he means by that. Now, it's not a subsidy for the economy as a whole. Having really complex government rules, the complexity we're talking about is from government, right? So complex rules, taxes, different sorts of regulatory policies. When those things are really complex, it can act as a subsidy, but not for the economy as a whole, right? These are bad for the economy as a whole. So if you're looking at it on an aggregate level, we don't want to have complex regulations. But the problem with that is that it can be a subsidy for big corporations and for politically well-connected corporations. Those aren't always the same things. There are some big corporations that aren't very politically well-connected, and there are some very well-connected corporations that aren't very big. But there is overlap there, and that should concern us as well. So how can it act as a subsidy? It acts as a subsidy because if something is really complicated, you're going to need to hire a lot of people to figure it out. And so if you're already a really big company, you have a lot of capability to go hire those people. That usually involves lawyers, it involves lobbyists, and it involves accountants for the tax code. All those kind of things. If you're a giant Fortune 500 company already, you can go hire those people. And they can spend all their time digging through the regulations, getting to the spots that would be advantageous for that company, and then exploiting the loopholes or various provisions that were put in there for that. The other way that it happens is in the process of the regulation being made. So in the process of the regulation being made, there are all sorts of public comment and feedback mechanisms for the government. So when they go out and they say, hey, we're going to issue this regulation, all these companies have time to give feedback to the government. So who's going to be the ones that are going to be doing that? Probably going to be the bigger ones, because again, they can pay people to study the rule being proposed, to make recommendations on it. And if the company is bigger, the government is more likely to listen to their complaints as well. Because they don't want to hurt a really big company with a regulation if they don't have to. Because if they hurt a really big company with it, that could result in job losses. If that results in job losses, it looks bad for the politicians. It's especially true if that business is located in a state that a congressman or senator represents, for example. And there's plenty of interplay between the regulatory agencies, members of Congress, and the presidency as well. And so they don't want to do things that would look bad from the president's perspective that might cost them in a state like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Arizona, states that are really important. And so if businesses in those places are talking about that, they're probably going to be more hesitant about that. And they're probably going to make carve-outs for those companies. So those companies end up benefiting from the regulation. Now, let's take this out of sort of general terms and talk about it a little bit more specifically with some examples. So one example is tech companies. Tech companies, not that long ago, 10, 15, 20 years ago, when companies like Amazon, Google were still relatively young, they didn't spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. They didn't do a whole lot because there was no reason to. They were out minding their own business, innovating, making new products, and sort of changing the way that we interact with a lot of things online, right? But in recent years, they have been some of the biggest spenders on lobbying. They have been some of the biggest. They've been opening new offices in and around Washington, D.C. Now, why is that? Because we've had a lot of politicians calling for regulations on tech companies. And so they said, well, if that's the case, then we need to be better connected so that those regulations will benefit us. And so that's exactly what they've done. They've been all over Washington, D.C., doing a lot more government relations, which is the sort of the nice word for lobbying, doing a lot more government relations than they had been doing in the past. And that's where you see tech companies have actually been asking for regulation. Facebook's parent company, Meta, which also owns Instagram, has been pushing for age limits on Instagram, for example, enforced by the government, because they want that regulation. And they know that if they call for the regulation, that they're going to have a lot of input in how that regulation gets made. And so that's where the complexity and just the addition of regulation becomes a subsidy for those companies, because they're going to be there helping to write the rules. And any new companies that want to come along are not going to be there. One, because they might not exist yet, and two, because if they're young and they're startups, they just don't have the resources to be able to be doing that. Another area is the financial sector. The financial sector, after the Great Recession, Congress passed Dodd-Frank law, which then also created thousands more pages of regulation after that, creating this incredibly complicated financial regulatory system in the United States. It goes across several different regulatory agencies. The Federal Reserve, the central bank itself, actually has a lot of regulatory power here. It created a new regulatory agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And all of that stuff, for all of the vilification of the big banks have become more powerful. Why? Because complexity is a subsidy. All of that stuff, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Wells Fargo, they can go out and hire as many lawyers as you want. They can go out and hire as many regulatory experts, as many lobbyists as you want. Anybody that wants to start a new bank or grow a smaller bank into a larger bank, they're not going to be able to do that. And so that's why we've seen even more power and concentration going to the big banks after Dodd-Frank than before. Trade policy is another area. The United States tariff schedule is over 4,000 pages long, has incredibly specific rules on things like rules of origin, about how much of a product has to be made in certain countries in order to count as being from that country, and what it gets taxed at based on that. Then we have over a dozen other separate trade agreements that the United States has done with other countries that create all sorts of exceptions and different rules on top of the actual tariff schedule. And then we have various executive authority that can basically do whatever it wants on trade policy through the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, which is part, he's appointed by the president, and they can do basically whatever on trade through that as well. And so if companies want to try to get around trade rules, there's all sorts of different ways to do that. So tariff engineering is sort of the process of that. One of the famous examples is Converse shoes. They come with this certain fuzzy kind of coating on the sole of the shoe so that they get classified for trade purposes as slippers, which is more advantageous than being taxed as shoes. There are all sorts of different examples like that where they do that. And then there's also examples of getting around country of origin rules by just routing shipments and routing supply chains through different countries. So you have tariffs on China, for example. Chinese companies then just go and they open factories in Vietnam or in Malaysia. And for them, it's just kind of an annoyance that they have to go do that, but they still get to sell the stuff to the U.S. Maybe they'll put shipments through Mexico instead of selling directly to the U.S., things like that. So they can just get around that kind of stuff. Now, you know who can't get around that kind of stuff is small companies. They can't do that. And so they're the ones who end up on the losing end of that. So again, complexity is a subsidy for the big and the well-connected. Another way that shows up in trade is just in deciding who gets tariffs and who doesn't. Steel companies in the United States are always benefits. It seems like they're always beneficiaries of protectionism. Reason for that is they have a very, very powerful and influential lobbying operation in Washington, D.C. They're very good at it. And hey, good for them. The government has set this up to work this way. So they're just taking what's theirs. Now, the solution is to stop giving them the opportunity to do this. But it works out pretty well when you have a trade representative like Robert Lighthizer, for example, under Trump, who used to work as a steel lobbyist. So he knows these issues really well, and then he gets in office and does what they wanted to do. So that sort of thing is an example of good connections mattering more than bigness, because steel companies aren't that big compared to other companies in the United States economy. They used to be much bigger, but nowadays they're not that big at all, but they're still very, very well connected. And so that's why they end up on the receiving end of a lot of benefits from protectionism. And then a final area where this is true is the tax code. Tax code is extremely complicated, especially the corporate tax code. And this works as a subsidy for big businesses that can hire as many accountants as you could possibly imagine to go through, find the tax credits that benefit them, find the different ways to evade taxes. Most of it completely legal, by the way. It's not like they're breaking the law to do this. It's just that they have the means and the resources to go through the tax code, study it really, really closely, and try their best to not have to pay taxes. And then politicians get mad at them about it. Well, they wrote the tax laws. If you don't want tax laws that allow corporations to get away with not paying very much in taxes, you shouldn't write tax laws that allow that to happen. But again, it's the big companies that can do this, not the small companies. The local restaurant in your town, they probably pay one accountant who works for another firm to do their books. They're not going through this stuff. And they don't have any ability to go actually lobby in Washington, D.C. and get the laws changed. They might be part of a trade group that does, but trade groups are no match for a personal relationship with a big CEO or something like that. And so the lesson to take away from this is that there's no right way to structure really complicated regulations, no matter how you do it. No matter how you do it, if you have a complicated regulation, it's going to benefit big companies because complexity is a subsidy. It's a subsidy for the well-connected, and it's a subsidy for the companies that can hire people to figure out what the rule even means. And you're going to end up with lots and lots of different situations where smaller companies are not even aware that they're breaking the rule. They weren't even trying to, but they end up being punished. Those kind of mistakes don't happen usually for bigger companies because they actually have the ability to figure it out. So the answer there is don't write really complicated rules to begin with. Doesn't matter what they're about. It doesn't matter if you agree with the ends of it. If you're concerned about big companies having too much power, complicated regulatory structures are always going to be their friend. Now it's time for the paper of the episode, but before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show and makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. So I let Bill pick the paper of the episode, and he picked one that he wrote. It's from the Economic Policy Innovation Center in February of 2024. It's called Is Inflation the Result of Excessive Deficit Spending? Here's Bill to tell you about it.
Yeah. So we have a paper out that looks at the causes of our current inflation. I say current inflation because we're not out of the woods. It turns out that about 60% of all the deficits that we have incurred since 2020 became credit instruments through the banking system for households and businesses. And it stimulated their spending, and that stimulated price growth. So at the root, at least this time, at the root of the current inflation was the monetization of deficits. Different than last time, different than 2010, when the Federal Reserve did not allow the deficits to become part of our credit and money system. This time they were allowed, and they boosted aggregate demand, which boosted prices.
Is Inflation the Result of Excessive Deficit Spending by Bill Beach? Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.